right, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Hannah. I'm the Assistant Director here at the Billings Public Library. Just want to take a second to say thank you for joining us today. We're going to have a wonderful program with Tami Haaland. She's a former Montana Poet Laureate, and she's going to share some of her work with us today. So please give a warm Billings welcome to Tami Haaland.
Hello, it's just wonderful to see you all here. Familiar faces. I'm noticing this, you know, when you go out and sometimes you don't see people for a long time, but now we're seeing each other again. And, just great to be here. Thank you so much for having me. So it's National Poetry Month. Started yesterday, and you know, I guess the idea is we share a lot of poems. You're probably getting poems in your email. On Twitter today, Ada Limon, who's a fabulous poet, posted that it's okay for poets to take naps and sleep and eat during National Poetry Month, which I loved. So my plan today is to, you know, share a few poems with you. Some of mine, I maybe will read, you know, a handful that are published. I have some poems from other people I would like to share as well, and then I might read you a few new poems. It's one of the things I'm missing, actually, is, you know, testing out new work in public, because somehow then you hear things in it that you miss in the quiet of your own space. So I won't continue all of that for too long, because I would love question and answer too, if there are things you'd like to talk about. So I will begin with a poem that a friend of mine gave me. Some of you may have known Elizabeth Fouillon, who taught at MSU Billings, who died a few years ago. And when she was nearing the end, we had become really such close friends, but in the sense, you know, when you've met somebody and you've worked together and you know you've got a lot of good time ahead, only we didn't. But this is a book she insisted on giving to me, and she kept telling me to go to her apartment and write poetry. And just before she found out she was ill, she made me promise to go to the Philippines to visit her, because that was her plan, to retire to the Philippines. So someday I'm going to get there. But this is a poem she told me she read every year on the first day of spring. It's a poem by, and I don't know if I'm saying it right, Si Ling Yun, translated by J.D. Frodsham. She told me he was a hiking poet. So earlier Chinese poetry was a little more still life in nature, but he is one of the early hiking poets, so he takes us into the mountains. And this is called On Climbing Stone Drum Mountain near Shangshu. The traveler is a prey to endless sorrows. As one grief goes, another comes behind. Such a long road leading back to my old home, with rivers and hills between that cannot be crossed. Time rushes by, yet no one shares my pleasures. So when spring comes, I have to start climbing alone. Perhaps, I thought, since no one shares my joys, I shall find a scene to suit my melancholy. Now I stare out to the plains that lie to the left, then turn my gaze to the gorges on my right. As the sun goes down, the mountain stream swells higher. As the clouds are born, the peaks are plunged in mist. White flag is vying with the young tree creeper. Green duckweed is just venturing into leaf. The fragrant plants I pluck brook no forgetting. All these delights I must enjoy alone. Not a trace of a friend to come and meet me here. The distance only mocks my loneliness. It's a bit of a sad opening, but it's beautiful, isn't it? And then another, this is published very recently. It's a translation. This is by a woman named Melissa Salma, whom I know nothing about her except that it says she's a poet and a photographer. It appeared in Poetry magazine, translated from the Spanish by Janet McAdams, who we used to bump into her, each other in a listserv that I belonged to for a while. It's called Reminiscence. I explore old waters, I search for the first fire. Infancy, that house filled with ghosts. My grandmother's courtyard, the earth, the trees from which I'm made. The guava smashing against the patio's red tiles mid-afternoon. Afternoons where I watched life pass by from a sidewalk. And I fooled myself believing my hands were made to narrate the world. I write, that's for sure. There's so much I want to name and that I can't, so much life slipping through my hands, so much shadow ruffling my hair, so many words suspended in the air, minuscule dust particles lit by the light from the window, that I must shake off the way someone shakes off the last layer of skin. And I lie as if I lie if I say that it's stone, mountain, sea, river, the birds taking flight, the corners of a house, my grandmother's face, her numerous ghosts, the ones who today ask to be counted. There's so much that I want to name and that I cannot. I write, that's for sure. Death from the other side is levitating. I just really like that. Because it speaks to why we do write. And I think as we all get older, the list of things we want to do gets more urgent. And when writing is one of those things, I think we're really compelled to get focused and move forward with it. So I'll switch now to some of my own poetry and tell you a little bit about it, I guess. So this book came out June of 21, and it's an old book. It came out, in fact, it was like a 20-year anniversary when it came out, but I was really lucky. This press in LA republished it. So, and Julie at the bookstore just wrote to me last night and said, we've sold out, which is, we all just love to hear that. So, but a few of these little poems have traveled a long ways. They've continued to have a life. And so I think I'll just share a couple with you. One you probably have heard me recite before, maybe, but what the heck. It's called Lipstick. I wonder how they do it, those women who put lipstick on their lips without looking, after they've finished a meal or when they ride in cars, satin claret or plum or twig or pecan. I can't stay inside the lines, latecomer to lipstick that I am, and sometimes get messy even in front of a mirror. But these women know where lips end and plain skin begins, probably know how to put their hair in a knot with a single pin. Just one more quick one, kind of a love poem, but it resurfaced in Verse Daily. It's always kind of sweet when those things happen. It's called Not Scientifically Verifiable. What if I walk around the corner and fish swim into my mind, and when a man I don't know walks past me, the thought leaps into his mind, and later he mentions to his wife that he would like to have fish, and so she goes out to get some since he asked, and the word escapes from her thoughts into the mind of the woman in aisle 3 who passes it to the checker, and so on. Only, what if I am really thinking of your breath on my neck, my fingers on your shoulders, your palm on the curve of my waist? We could explain how these thoughts leap from one mind to another with words like pheromone or hormone. It's harder to say why fish might take this course, except they have been known to swim upstream 500 miles, as you or I might, if only for a slim chance. You don't need to clap every time. It's nice that you do. It's really nice, but you don't have to. Don't feel obligated. Because I'll just keep going. I'll just keep going for a while here. So this is the second book, and I don't have any copies of it on my table back there. But I'll just read the title poem, which again you've probably heard. But these are poems from my younger life, and so that there are children featured in both books, smaller, and of course they're grown people now. When we wake in the night, those of you who sleep through don't know what you're missing. Late constellations, owls in tamarack, shadows on carpet, cool floors. We know who leaves lights on. We know when the morning paper arrives, how the carrier idles her car, parks, walks 3 houses, and goes. In the dark, the leaden feeling of children growing away pulls for attention. The son who didn't get his swing set no longer needs one. If we sit on the porch in summer or fall, maybe we hear a gray catbird, its single descending call over water. It likes sumac, yellow dock, the dark. So I'll just let that go. I want to tell you a story about this poem, though. When I was poet laureate, I was reading in this big gala reading in Missoula. It was the last time Montana, our Humanities Montana sponsored the book festival in Missoula. And so they had this gala reading that featured everybody. And I got there, and they had sort of told us we could say a few things. Well, I got there without a book, and then found out everybody else was reading. So I had my turn. I knew when it was coming, and I focused on that poem, which I did not have memorized. But the rhythms of these things, as Dave knows, I mean, they are inside you. And I worked at it, and I worked at it, and I worked at it, and I was going up the stairs to read. I got the final words and was able to deliver the poem because it was there. I just had to uncover it, which I find fascinating. And so I was sort of doing that driving down here too, kind of saying, I wonder if I could say that by heart again, but I don't think I've had enough prep time for it, so it was safer this way. And I often tell my students, it's like music, there's a subtext to poetry, just as there is in music. So you listen to the lyrics, so that all that's well and good, but it's the rhythm, it's the key, it's the tempo. I mean, there are all of these elements that come together that directly affect your mood. And poetry can have that same kind of impact on us, and it's not in the words necessarily. Okay, and so this is the most recent book, 2018, and I'm going to read maybe 2 or 3 poems from this one. And then switch to some new work, which, as I say, I would just love to be able to share. And maybe I will try to read some that I don't read quite as often. This one features my mother. It came out after her death, and she's sort of like the running motif in this book, which I didn't initially realize. I gave the manuscript to Melissa Kwasny, and she said, "Your mother is everywhere. We've got to move her around so that she becomes really the center of this book." And it was a perfect solution to what needed to happen before it was published. So this one is called Gift, and I would have dreams about her. This is particularly a dream. But you do all of that. When the parents die, you do all of that sorting, all of that, sifting through the house kind of work. And so this was sort of an extension of that. Gift. I look through drawers, sure you have left something else, a code, a secret message, the long-awaited, beloved something I wanted without knowing. And you show up, frail beyond your oldest self, barely able to move. You lead me to a hidden cabinet only you have known, placed deep in a wall and full of shoes belonging to generations past, to people who had places to go. Some almost new, others worn brittle and thin, a history. You lift a pair made of midnight glass, slippers with painted white horses galloping on the sides, their manes tossed and the shoes unscathed. You offer them, and I see how you have saved them, and they're mine. This one is called The Other. I was thinking specifically of Simone de Beauvoir and woman as other, that kind of idea, but then I just really got playing and spinning along with it. The other. When I say the other side, you may think death, not life, or as in de Beauvoir, woman, not man, or us, not them, opposite colors, or this, not that. But what I mean is the flip side of the page, heads, tails, 50-50. Drafting, in this case, the other side, not yesterday's poem, but the one I'm writing now, not for me, but for you. This is called Night Journey. A friend who was reading this book, and I saw some of his notes, and he wrote flat at the ending. Which I get. I mean, it's a very subdued ending. But anyway, I'm going to read this. Night Journey. I rode in a train whose cars were broad, like the rooms of a house. I had forgotten something when I changed to this train and felt certain I would not get it back. Through a doorway, a man at a bar served drinks and slices of red melon shaped thin like glass. I could see light through slivers of vibrant fruit. Far ahead rode my mother and father. Though I hadn't seen them, I knew we were traveling together, and I had the most ordinary thought that I would go to them. Okay, one more. I'm going to read What Does Not Return, which also has, it's a very serious poem, but there's a funny story lurking behind it, so I'll finish off with that, but I'll read the poem first. And this takes place, if you've ever been on that ferry between Boston and Provincetown, that's kind of where this is, or in Provincetown, it's kind of where it's set, but it could be any place by an ocean. What does not return? I took an oyster, a hinged wonder from the small bay because of its glistening apricot surface, sculpted like the half shells in the sand, then kept it, admiring its beauty, noting that without water, it lost part of its shine. After a day or two, I noticed darkness beneath its iridescent shell. Dead, I supposed. Then I felt a responsibility, at least, to put it where it belonged. I took it in my purse and planned to return it to water, but every time I forgot. Thinking the open shells on the shore would be my reminder, I became so enamored with their fragments catching the sun, I had to walk away from so much light. In the ferry going back to the mainland, I saw my first whale and couldn't stay in my seat, thrilled at the arc of its slick blackness emerging, then immersing. I thought, here I am again, failing to put to rest the past, the thing shriveling in the interior, while this creature, already a memory, overtakes what cannot be undone. So indeed that happened. But the thing is, I was then going to Bennington for this 20-year reunion thing or 10-year reunion or something. And I still had this oyster, so I didn't want to throw it in the garbage someplace because that just seemed disrespectful. And I got to Bennington, and then what was I going to do with it? Well, so there is this big rock wall down at the end of this big field, and we call it the end of the world. And so I thought, well, I'll just put it there. Nobody will ever know. And so I just slipped it in. And I hope it didn't bother anybody, smell-wise or anything. Okay, so I'm going to read a few new poems. There is gradually a manuscript emerging. I really need time. I need, time away to get this job done. But I want to read a few because it's a nice chance to test them out. I'll tell you in advance, I'm playing with some themes. One has to do with ancestry and identity, and I've been just on a long journey with that one, always fascinated with, the ancestors and who they are, and I continue that exploration. And then, of course, DNA comes into the picture, and then what I love about all of this, and what I knew I would find, right? You get this story of who you are. You're half this, you're half that. And then you start exploring further and you realize, oh, but wait, they married somebody from this other heritage. And then you get the DNA results, and then you're like, oh, wow, look at this. And of course, it's all exponential. I mean, it just goes back and gets more and more and more diverse. So the silliness of, I will have to admit, I was like, this whole white supremacy thing, it is just such a fallacy, it's silly. And so that was very much on my mind, and this exploration backwards. So that's one thing that's going on, but then there's that who am I question. And I've always loved Jungian psychology, and so that exploration of self with the big S versus self with a little s, the idea of selfishness versus sort of this identity that is sort of akin to your soul, the thing that you spend your life discovering. So I'm really working back and forth with these. And eventually I'll put things together and probably edit out the word self a whole bunch because it's way too frequently there. But that's what I'm playing with. And and I'm also in this first poem I'm going to read playing with what we call mirror image poetry. So you write it and then you reverse it. Right? You start with the last line and then the second to the last and so on, and with modification. But this one is written in columns like this, and it's called Spectrum. I think it'll have a better title eventually, but I'm playing with the little self and the big self. That day, standing outside the music room, playing a racing game with classmates, you made a comment about the girl who would die first among you. And your teacher heard how petty you were and spoke to show you this was not your best self. Still, you persist, discontent, shadow of who you want to be. Who do you want? Who do you want to be and how to persist? Your best self, searching for words, for wonder, your teacher, the world, and you, the girl who is racing with the others, for the joy of wind and speed, the body, a vehicle for yourself, you alive, still, whenever possible, standing outside. This one's called Understanding Silence. It may be a possible title. I'm also playing a lot with questions. And this one kind of plumbs that possibility of the ancient history of each of us. Understanding silence. Words didn't do. She angled one way and another. Sentences couldn't complete. It was awkward. Was it a feeling? This inadequate something, her strength, invisibility. A friend said, maybe some archetype, some churning in the gut, welling up, something old. Now and then she had it, a firefly, a flash, then nothing. It would come, her friend said. It would arrive without words. What if it was so old it was not yet human? What if it was old human, inherited memory? Except for nomadic tendencies and a host of animals now extinct on the horizon, wouldn't much of it have been the same? Who was it in that time? Who was it who said, now you must speak? And this is one of those DNA poems. I've got these floating around too. So this is called Portrait with Mitochondrial DNA. So the mitochondria is what stays consistent for a long time. We inherit it from our mothers. They got it from their mothers, back and back and back and back and back. My particular mitochondrial DNA is K1A, which is like, I think, 27,000 years old, which is fascinating. I just find this fascinating. Plus, they can trace all the way back to the original groups in Africa, and this is part of how we begin to develop these and understand these migratory patterns. So anyway, I'm playing with this, and then they say, you could be all of these things, which is delightful, this sort of massive expansiveness. Portrait with Mitochondrial DNA. From the early, and they're all labeled with these like letter number things, by the way. So, from the early L3, who came out of Africa or went deeper in. From N, who went into the Balkans, Russia, Eastern Europe, then U and K1, and with 3 of the 4 subtypes tied to the earliest of Ashkenazi Jews, which puts our line in Central Asia, maybe, and A, which connects me to 0.8% of humans who nurtured my relations, who are distant cousins. We are part Neanderthal, those peaceful ones, I like to think, who played flute and made prayers 60,000 years ago. Maybe that ancestor was conceived near fire on animal skins, maybe a cave for shelter, maybe spring. In an elevator between the lobby and 5th floor of an unfamiliar building, briefly I panic. What if my mother's mitochondria, my grandmother's and great-grandmother's back to our Eve, who carried the most recent mutation, say 28,000 years ago, whoever she was, who passed to her children a replica of her own DNA. What if I am the end of her line, my brothers passing on Ys, me sending mitochondria into my sons? A terrible responsibility I didn't know I had. But then I remember the science, these many relations, and my girl cousins born to my aunt, their daughters and granddaughters, energetic mitochondria of the cell moving forward. We are 56 million, this K1A mutation in Poland and Germany, Belarus, Ukraine. Some of us are Czech. We come from early hunters, Central Asian nomads. Our Ice Age ancestors wintered in North Africa, Spain, Portugal, and some arrived in Ireland and Scotland, maybe the Netherlands or Norway, Siberia, Finland. It goes on. Somewhere, the DNA report mentions Turkmenistan, Armenia, Bulgaria, the Sami. We've tracked animals, made tools, built fires. We are diggers, caretakers, talkers, travelers, keepers of stories, and more than a few of us have envied the flight of birds. I think I'm going to read two more. This one is a shift now, has more to do with that idea that you inherit things. So we inherit things, we inherit our DNA. This is all about the things and the things that our mothers keep for us. My mom kept everything. My mother's art enters the world. Though I was sure my doll's hair would grow back when I trimmed, sure I could see it extend to confirm what I already knew, I was left in these later years with brutalized, hard-sided, soft-sided, blonde and brunette, multi-sized dolls who I don't remember ever having loved. The more important question always, what could I make them do? I wrapped them together, put them in a Metropolitan Museum of Art bag, and let them sit in my office for months while I lingered over an orange flowered dress with gathered skirt, button back, lace around its sleeveless openings, its model a bright blonde with hair trimmed almost to the scalp. I wondered if I should save the dress my mother made, one more piece of her handiwork, a diminishment, this word, a sign of her skill to make something that fit exactly and probably matched a dress of my own. This morning, I walk the bag down 8 flights of stairs to the art department free box and think, I should have photographed it, and think, now someone will find my mother's art. And this is a poem written for a prompt. So Sean Ray, who you may know, a poet from this part of the world too, is doing this anthology. And the name of the anthology is We Are All God Poems, and that We Are All God's Poems, and that has to also be the name of every poem that everybody who contributed to it wrote. So it was due in like 3 weeks, and I just, but they haven't found a publisher yet, and so I wrote him like a month ago. This was, I don't know, last March or something. And he said, yeah, you can still send it in. So I finally got my poem after writing multiple versions, and I'll just close with this. We are all God's poems. Each day I hike into wildness edging the city. Trails wind and converge, human paths built on deer trails built on human paths, ant trails through sage and sand that allowed them to make their own small city last spring. Gnarled and twisted pines, some dead, mark the way, their roots surrounded by stone. Some tree bodies choose to lie down or lean into each other. There is a hawthorn, its ripe berries hanging in dark clusters, a pine where a single magpie watches. I love each step, the influx, the way boulders split into uneven pieces when a juniper or ponderosa seeds itself on top. And when I return home, the mountain ash, the last to let go its leaves this November, even on cloudy days, seems to glow with light from within. Thank you. Do you have questions?
Did you always want to do this?
When I was 12, I decided I was going to be a poet. And why, I don't know, really. I mean, I grew up in a household where there was plentiful music and plentiful art. My dad was an amateur oil painter, an artist. And so when I was writing reports in elementary school, for example, I remember I had this seabird report, and I asked him to draw the cover for it. And there were jam sessions, family jam sessions, and he was also in a dance, he had a dance band in his youth, and two of my brothers ended up in bands, and so there was always music. It was just pervasive, but somehow I gravitated to poetry, and and then in my teen years, I just made up my mind somehow, and in my teen years, I just kept this notebook, and I still have it. I probably should figure out, have a ceremonial fire and get rid of it at some point before I die, but it's still there. Yeah.
Love of poetry came from 4th grade. We had a teacher, we learned a poem every month.
Yes,
And
isn't that
ever
wonderful?
Since we've done that, I like poetry.
Yeah. Yes.
I love, all of your poems were beautiful, by the way, but the poem
Thank
about
you.
the shoes,
Yeah.
that transition that you made from, I can't remember I can't memorize the poem in my
Yeah.
head, but that's a struggle for me, going from sort of, I just wondered what that process is. Is there a specific word you use or a poetic style that goes from, and the specific about the shoes was so good, but I don't know how you did that. I don't know what I'm trying to ask.
Yeah, no, it's like, how do you get
I'm sorry.
No,
What
it's
is it,
good.
Joe?
It's a good question. It's like, how do you get where you're going in a poem?
Yeah.
The truth is, I think most of us who write poetry don't know.
Okay.
You know?
I'm sorry. I'll get back here. So I think the truth is most of us who write poetry don't know. I find for myself, in that understanding silence piece, I said something welling up. That's my experience of writing a poem. It's something physical. It's I catch a thread. I catch a word or a phrase, something like that. And if I take the time to write it down, it just goes on, and I try to catch the rush. The thing is, if I slow down, then I can start thinking about it too much, and then it can get sort of cute, like, oh, I see what I'm doing here, right? Better for me if I just rush with it as a less conscious process. And I think in that particular poem, I knew I was going towards that pair of shoes. I didn't know how I was going to get there. Yeah, it was like, so sometimes I'll have just an image or a notion, and I don't really know sometimes whether I'm starting or ending with it. I just roll. Yeah. Does that ring true for the poets in the room, Joe and Steve and Danelle?
Never know where you're going.
And Kara. Yeah. I mean, that's the fun of it. It's the process of discovery. Kara, is that your experience, and Bernie? Yeah.
It always seemed like a good idea at the time.
It always is. Exactly. Which is why, and we talked about this actually, we were all on a panel earlier this year, and we said that's why you never tell anybody about the new poem for at least like a day or two, because when you look back, it may be wretched. There may be something salvageable, but it may be awful. But while you're doing it, it feels like, oh my gosh, what a. Yes.
How long will you leave something open to editing?
Oh, a long time. I'm slow. I've become aware that, you know, many poets in the world whom I know are really good at pushing through, you know, finishing it up, getting it out, sending it off for publication. I find that my life is probably too busy most of the time. But that, you know, that could also be an excuse. But, you know, it could be that I am just slow to configure what I do. And I should also say that Danelle and Kara and I have been in a writing group together for, I don't know,
All of eternity.
practically, yes. I mean, it was several books ago for all of us. Yeah, so it's the feedback too. You can think you're brilliant, but then you get feedback and they're saying, why did you repeat yourself?
I think the deadline, because I don't have those, that probably helps a lot with the polishing. Do you ever get rid of something, or you always keep it around if it's unfinished?
Oh, I have what I call my compost pile, and it goes in there. It stays on my computer. You know, I still go back to stuff that's kind of ancient, and I think, you know, that's a good line. And you know, at that point, what I should do probably is scrap everything, pull the line forward, and maybe see if it can turn into something. Yeah.
And thank you very much.
Thank you. Anything else? Yes, Craig.
Yeah, so,
Good to see you.
yeah, you as well. So now that you have a body of work, are you able to look at it in reverse and pick out what was art and what was carpentry? Or do you, or do you have a hard time distilling it that way?
Yeah. No, that's a really good question. Well, it was a pretty weird experience having this 20-year-old book come out again. And to be honest, I hired Mike Wade, who is a former student, to go through and, you know, edit, proofread, do all of that, because I just didn't even want to face it. I did read through it, and I got all caught up in, you know, they said you cannot change stuff, right? It has to be in its original form. I got all caught up, and I thought, I bet I can sneak some edits into this one. And then I backed off. But yeah, there's stuff in there that I wouldn't do now. But the other interesting thing that happens, I think, is sort of like what we were talking about with the poem itself. Like, I look at where this has gone, where the new work is going, and I look back at some old poems and I say, that's where I was going all along. I mean, this is a very long-term interest that I didn't know I had, or that I would continue. Yeah. How about you? Do you see those things in your work? Do you? You didn't know I was going to turn it on.
No.
you.
Damn it. Probably a little different with prose, at least
Yeah.
for me. The once a decade poem I write, I never know where in the world it came from. And
Yeah.
I'm just happy to have it because, you know, I'll be much older when I see another one. You know.
Yeah.
That's why I so admire, you know, folks who can bear down and do the work.
I have a friend who's she's an actor. She was part of the Bennington crew too. She was an actor, and she was studying fiction, writing a novel, and just stuck. And she went to some residency, I think, and she sat in with the drawing class. And at some moment, this whole big poem came out, and she ended up sending it to all of us, and it was the thing that unblocked her passage into the novel. So I think these things, yeah, feed off of each other. Okay.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Has getting older changed your relationship to writing?
I think, you know, kind of where I started with this, I feel like I'm more focused. I'm feeling like I know what I would like to accomplish in the next 10 years. I know that I need time away this summer so that I can get this organized. So there's that. I, you know, as you know from the writing group, I'm tending towards more philosophical stuff, which, of course, is not sometimes as vivid. And so I've got to figure out how to deal with that. Early on, it was easy. I was out with my kids all the time. We lived among little creatures, and, there was just imagery everywhere. And I am enamored with the woods and hiking and the details I find there. But I'm finding also some repetition that, I need new eyes a little bit to, I don't know. I feel like I'm going through a stage. I feel like I'm going somewhere, but I'm going through a stage to get there. Yeah. Do you find your writing changed at all?
I feel like I'm just learning all the time.
Yeah.
I think poetry's, I've been writing a lot more prose, but, every project has a whole new set of challenges that you don't know how to solve.
Yeah.
But to me, that frustration is also what keeps it interesting. If I knew how to do it, I'd be bored and wouldn't want to do it anymore.
Exactly. Yeah, and I think that's true. I wrote this essay that came out this year called What Does Your Poem Want to Be? It's in a book called The Strategic Poet. And it's a great book, actually. It's got essays and prompts and all kinds of stuff in it. But what I said was, you don't want every poem to be the same pirouette, right? You don't want them to do the same things. You do stay engaged. And part of me is always testing. Like when somebody says, somebody did this to Robert Wrigley, or he responded to it, that notion, you should never put the moon in a poem. So he wrote a poem that had the moon all over it, repeated many, many times. So if somebody, it's that challenge, right? You can't do this. And I think, well, can I? Let's give it a try. Yeah. Well, thank you. I have books back there. They're $15. I have a stack of $5 bills if you need change, and this house of books also carries my books, except we know they're sold out of breath in every room, but they'll get some, I'm sure. And I just want to thank you so much for being here. It's so great to see you all.
Thank you.